Well, let's go ahead and get started. Let me lead in the word of prayer, and then I want to introduce Greg to you, and then Greg, I will turn it over to you for your presentation, okay?
Okay.
Our gracious God, as we meet together, scattered across our nation today, we ask for the help of your Spirit and for you to invade all that we do and say and hear and learn. We are grateful for this opportunity to add resources to our toolboxes. We're grateful for the ministries you give us, and I pray that we might experience again your blessing through what Greg shares with us today. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I met Greg Wines soon after my first book came out called Hit the Bullseye. At that time, he was the state, I guess, executive, I forget what the term is, for Church of God Anderson. Welcome, John, up in Alberta. Glad to see you here.
Good to be here.
He was the state pastor for Church of God Anderson in Florida, and we had some interesting times together. Greg's not only been an effective pastor, but really did a lot of transformation work, not only in Florida, but throughout Church of God Anderson. But his specialty really is in helping people get coached in terms of looking for positions, finding positions, working with organizations that are looking for people, for pastors, for staff, etc. And so I asked Greg if he would take some time today to give us an overview of what he does, how he does it, what are the key issues he is looking for as he deals with helping people find staff. And then as normal, when Greg is done, we'll take some time for questions and go from there. So Greg, welcome. We're glad to have you with us today.
Thanks, Paul. I consider it a privilege. And I just recently published a book called Dying to Restart. It's about how churches need to die and how other churches can adopt them and so forth. And in that book, I attribute in the acknowledgments, Paul is one of my mentors. So I will tell you that anything that I say you don't like, no doubt Paul taught me. And anything you do like came from other sources. Appreciate that. One of the things I appreciate most about Paul is that he was willing to give away anything, and he didn't own anything, and he just really was willing to give away his best stuff, and I appreciate that. And in light of that, anything that I say today, all the notes, I'll send you a link afterwards, and you can go download all the notes, so you don't have to worry about taking notes if you're interested. I want to talk today about assessments, and the interesting thing for me, again, because this is kind of my forte, because I've spent a lot of time in it, the interesting thing for me is so it's really becoming a cool thing today to do assessments, and it's in vogue to, take all kinds of assessments. But the problem is, from my perspective, we often don't use them in an appropriate way. So I want to talk about assessments today from a number of perspectives. And again, I really encourage you guys to ask questions as we go or wait to the end. But the first couple of questions I want to hit up front here. And one is, and what's the number one mistake that is often made in hiring? And this may sound a little bit odd, but I think that from my perspective, having been through hundreds and hundreds of probably thousands of these processes, it's people hire to a need rather than to a plan. And let me just say, it's not either or, but what I often have happen is it's kind of like my sister who had a house that literally they built one room at a time, and they kept adding on another room and then another room and then another room. And literally it was condemned eventually, because it just had no plan. It was horribly done. And I see staffs done that same way. People hire to a need. I have this need, then I hire this need, and then I hire this need. And their staff is built out in that kind of a method rather than some kind of plan. And to me, again, the idea is to have a plan. And yet you hire to a need, and it's okay to hire even in crisis. But you want to avoid the one and done kind of thing that's so often done. I'm just going to hire this person, and then my next need, I'll go hire that other person without a thought of what's the plan. So what does a plan look like? Well, from my perspective, it's an intentional staffing model that's based upon several factors. One is who you are, your wiring, as I talk about, because as the lead pastor, to me, the staff needs to come out of your wiring. It needs to complement you to fulfill the mission God's given you to lead that church in. And it's not like you're an autocrat necessarily, but the reality is your wiring does determine what the rest of the team needs to look like, especially an EP position or XP, depending on what you call it, executive pastor. I so often have people ask me, well, is this a good XP or is this not, or EP? And I say, well, it all depends on who's the lead pastor, who's the LP, because to me, the EP and the LP kind of do a dance, and totally depending on the wiring of the lead pastor determines the wiring of the executive pastor. but it's even true in a general context of that staffing team. So it's dependent on your wiring, your vision, your philosophy of ministry, your own capacity and bandwidth, the church's culture, the funding model you have. I mean, there's all kinds of factors that influence this thing, and it's healthy to develop a staffing model built upon some of the unique particularities that you each possess in your churches. And it's not either or. It's not a bad thing to hire to a crisis or an immediate need, but it has to just be consistent with some kind of general overall strategy and approach. And one of the things is you'll realize, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, is we often outgrow our staff. So even when you hire well, you'll have to allow them to leave well too, and we'll get to that in a moment. But one of the things that happens so often is when we think we hire staff, they're going to be with us for a long term, and that doesn't necessarily happen. And we'll kind of get to some of that in a moment. But I've worked at churches like Community Christian in Chicago, and David Ferguson. He 5 guys that he started with 25 years ago are still with him in one way or another, and churches so many different campuses and everything else, and doing great work. But then you work with Hybels. Well, and I used to say 5 of the 6 couples who founded the church left. Well, now there's 6 because Bill's gone. So they all fairly soon in the initial stages, the launch team, the lead staff and the leaders of the church left fairly quickly. So and it's not wrong or right. It's not like one is right and one is wrong. There's a lot of factors that figure into that. So to me, that's the biggest mistake made in hiring is we hire to immediate need rather than to an overall plan. But some of the other mistakes that I see that churches make and lead pastors make is the first one probably I would say is the lead pastor doesn't understand their A game. They don't understand their own wiring. They may know in their gut intuitively what it is, but they're not able to articulate it in a way that allows their team to develop around them in ways that help complement them. And my mentor told me at one time, he says, Greg, you always do what you have an unfair advantage in. So what's the area that you have an unfair advantage? And there's a guy in a fairly large church in Ohio who I've worked with quite closely. And, he doesn't like me to say this, but, his unfair advantage is communication. He is a phenomenal teacher. The church has grown from 650 to 1,500 in the 3 or 4 years he's been there. But it's because of his communication ability. It's not his leadership. Well, it took him having some significant anxiety before he came to realize that probably leadership isn't his A game, and and he needs to some way develop a team that can handle the leadership and allow him just to focus on the communication, because he's a phenomenal communicator and that's his gift. So it's a matter of figuring out what is your wiring, what are your strengths. I'll get to wiring in a minute because that's what assessments look at. They don't look at calling. Assessments look at wiring. So I'll get to that in a minute. Another mistake I think that lead pastors often make, besides not knowing their own wiring, is letting others set their expectations. Now that may be others in the church or maybe others outside the church. You should be doing, have you tried, yada, 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 rather than understanding that you as a lead pastor, you're fearfully and wonderfully made, and you've got certain rhythms that you work well within. And the sooner you work consistent with your wiring, the better. One of the things I do in my debriefs, I have people write their signature in their dominant hand. They write their signature and I time them. And then I have them do it in their non-dominant hand. And I time them with that. And I show them how much uglier the non-dominant hand is. And it usually takes 3 to 4 times longer to do that. Now you can sign your name with your non-dominant hand. And a lot of leaders, especially lead pastors, can lead in areas that they're not strong in. But it's uglier and it takes a lot more effort and time. And so, why not do your ministry in your dominant hand? And so that's kind of, when I talk about wiring, when I talk about, letting others set your expectations, what I'm talking about is you figuring out what works for you. Another interesting thing, and it kind of goes along with these first two, is that, mistake that lead pastors make for me is they often project their own strengths onto others. For instance, I'll just use DISC because it's easy and it's, fairly easy to understand. But, a high D pastor, they want everybody to do ministry just like they do, just to get stuff done. High I pastor, they just want everybody to be friendly and, in the moment with people. And a high S people wants everything to be planned and executed. And a high C person wants all the details covered, so a lead pastor often projects their own strengths into others rather than saying, okay, these are my strengths. Now, how do I help others do the ministry in a way that complements my strengths and not project my strengths onto them? Some of the big flags that I find in assessments is you need to understand that it was Drucker who first said this, that the best predictor of future performance is past behavior. So if you want the best assessment, look what someone's been, and it's a good predictor of where they'll be. And I'm not saying I don't believe in grace, I don't believe in transformation, I don't believe in restoration, all those kind of things. But what I am saying is where a person's been is probably the best predictor of where they're going. In fact, there's this little book Parker Palmer wrote, you may have read it, called Let Your Life Speak. And, it's all about, if you want to look at where you're going, look at where you've been. Let your life, where God's taking you, describe where, speak to where you're going to be going. One of my biggest frustrations in this whole area of assessment with leaders is they use a single instrument or two to identify the potential hire, whether they're appropriate or not, and they base it on one instrument or two instruments. And I'm often a little concerned with that, because I really believe Psalm 139, which says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And so I think your assessment process, your hiring process, if you will, should reflect that, should reflect this truth. I believe everyone in the world has an A game. And the problem is with most staff in churches today is, one, they don't know what their A game is, or two, their role isn't aligned to that A game. And that was a lot of the Gallup research that led to a lot of Buckingham's work came out of that, people simply don't know their strengths, their A game, and the role they're filling doesn't match that if they do. So, one of the other big questions I wanted to address is, why do teams break down in this area? And I can deal with it from the perspective of assessments. And I mentioned a moment ago that sometimes you outgrow your staff, and that's not a bad thing. That's the roles and responsibilities that a person have evolve, especially churches on the right-hand side of the life cycle, church or the left-hand side, churches that are growing and going, often the roles, responsibilities for that position evolve into something that's beyond the capacity and or bandwidth of the staff. Now, those are two issues. When I talk about bandwidth and or capacity and bandwidth are different. We can get into that later if we have time, but it's not a bad thing that staff roles outgrow staff. It's just a difficult thing. So what do you do with them? Well, we'll talk at the end about how do you promote people. And to me, you always try to promote them out of their current position. And you can do that by helping them understand what is their A game. And we'll get to that in a moment. But I want you to understand that one of the reasons staff teams break down is because simply the team, that role has outgrown the capacity or the bandwidth of that individual. Another one is, I think, and this is often the case, is that there's a cultural incompatibility. It's not a competence, not that they can't do the job. It's not that they lack character or even that they're not called. Now, we often frame it in those three things between competence, character, and calling, but it's most often culture. And a good passage, by the way, on this is Acts 11:25, where Barnabas, is told by the Jerusalem church, go to Antioch. This gospel is going to these Gentiles. We have no clue what's happening. You got to go there and, lead this church. So Barney goes there, and in Acts 11:25 and following, or 32, it's 25 and following, Barnabas he gets to Antioch. He looks at these Gentiles, and he's a good Jew. I mean, if you look at Barney's life, Barnabas, he's a good Jew. And he looks at these Gentiles, he has no clue. So what does he do? The first thing he remembers is this Saul from Tarsus, this Jewish man raised in a Gentile culture. So he goes to get Paul. See, he clearly understood there was a cultural incompatibility with his background and these people. So he went and got someone who could bridge that culture. And I see so often teams break down because of a cultural mismatch. Not because the person's not competent or doesn't have character, or isn't even called, but it's just that they don't match the culture. The unique particulars that describe the way either ministry is done in your church or in your community, the way life is lived in your community. We can talk later about that if you have questions on that, but that's a very common thing of why teams break down from my perspective. Another one is different callings. There are situations, and it's Acts 15. You're all familiar with verse 32 and following, where Paul and Barnabas get in this major fight over it. Basically, it's a calling issue. Barney, he's a lover of people. He's a redeemer. He helps restore people. I mean, that's what he had done to Paul when Paul first became a believer in Jerusalem. So, that's Barnabas's role. And so when John Mark, who twinked off on them on the first missionary journey, wants to come back, when Barnabas wants to bring him, and we all know it's his cousin, so there's some family relationship there, but Barnabas wants to restore John Mark and take him with him on the second missionary journey. And Paul says, no way, Ray, we're not taking this guy. Now, if you really understand the two of those guys, again, it's not that one's wrong and one's right. People try to take positions on that. But reality is that Paul's mission was to plant churches. It was to go out and start churches. And he started at least 16 that we know of in the New Testament. Well, he's a pretty driven taskmaster. He's probably a DC on the DISC scale kind of thing. Not so with Barnabas. Barnabas probably was an IS, probably just a lover of people kind of thing. And so it was a different sense of calling. So the cool thing is, you see there the team broke down because their calling was evolving into something different. So Barnabas went, we know he took John Mark and restored him, because at the very end of Paul's life, Paul says, bring John Mark with you, Timothy, in 1 Timothy 4:11. He says, bring him with you. And I love what he says, not because I love the guy, but bring him with you because he's of use to me. So Paul still didn't change. He's still a task-oriented guy at the very end of his life. But obviously, John Mark's been restored. And so, Barnabas did a great job. They each did well in their own ministry. So for me, teams break down because of a calling that changes or evolves. Because obviously, they were on the same team for a while. But as they began to both mature in their calling, their callings varied. And the last reason I see that teams break down is what I call, there's a planter in utero. Read Acts 9, Paul did not fit in Jerusalem. We're told in verse 32 that he left. They sent him back to Tarsus because he was causing some problems. They sent him back to Tarsus, and in verse 32, we're told that, and the church experienced growth. It was blessed, and the Holy Spirit was doing all kinds of great things. When Paul left, and they grew in number, by the way. So, Paul was enter in utero. And I see that so often in churches, that there's a staff person that's not working on a team. And the real issue is that the church is pregnant. At least that pastor is experiencing a call to plant. And they're experiencing that call as frustration in their current team, like Paul did there in Jerusalem. And so by upsetting the whole system in Jerusalem, they finally got rid of him and things settled down and did well. Well, and we know what the rest of Acts tells us what happened with Paul as he went on planting churches. So, and I've seen it happen a number of times where once we recognize there's a call of a planter on this life. Now, how do he may not, or she may not plant from within our movement. They may, or our church, we may help them exit and do it somewhere else. But at least it's acknowledging that it's not right or wrong. It's just a call to plant, and it's a planter in utero. One of the exercises I do with larger teams, well, I've done them in teams up to about 27 staff, is we look at, there are certain functions that every leader does well. And so it's called the team fit exercise. And we look at staff teams from about 6 different angles, 6 different ways. And the thing that always amazes me is it's often the older people, the older staff who are more at peace with what their wiring is. And it's the younger staff who say, oh, I can do that. And they want to do everything. They think they can do everything. And it is true that you spend about the first half of your life figuring out what you're not good at. In the second half of ministry, you get to do that. But, I see that so often in this team fit exercise, that oftentimes in a team, the younger staff haven't quite figured out their wiring. And so that sometimes causes some friction, because they're always they'll do everything, even if they don't do it well. So that's why, for me, I've seen teams break down. A couple more questions, and then I'll just throw it open. One is how to use assessments effectively. Let me just say this, and I alluded to it earlier, that assessments don't measure calling. Assessments measure wiring. Now, I'll give you credit. Wiring has often informs calling a lot, but assessment just talks about wiring. And so therefore, as you look at the wiring, and assessments are really good to look at a person's wiring, and the only thing they identify is wiring in an individual. So if that's true, then I would suggest that for assessments to be used effectively, you really, first of all, need to know kind of know your target. In other words, anytime that someone asks me to assess an individual, I always say, well, what am I assessing them for? You can't say, is this person a good football player? Because the competencies required to be quarterback are entirely different than the competencies for a tight end or a guard, offensive guard. So it's the same thing, you always, to assess someone, you need to say, what are the competencies? What are the expectations? What are the skill sets, so to speak, that we're assessing this person to? What's the wiring kind of criteria? And at this point, I would just say something about assessments, and I believe in assessments. I do a whole lot of that stuff. I write them, I develop them, I use them a lot. But let me just say that one of my concerns with assessments, and there's two strains of psychology, basically. One is called trait psychology, which says, we all have certain traits that we conform to, we lean into, and we, if we're a D, we act this way, or if we're an E on the Myers-Briggs, or if we're, whatever scale we want to use, if we're this way, we act this way. Well, that's trait psychology. There's another whole bunch of psychologists. It's called social cognitive psychology, which says basically, when you enter a social situation, you often process that. That's the cognitive. You're thinking, how do I need to act? And you respond based on that social context. So in other words, a D doesn't always act like a D based on the context. A lot of times a D may not act like a D. You probably have Ds on your staff who may not be in a lead position, and so they don't act like a D in the social context of what you are. And so the danger of assessments is if we only assess the traits but don't assess the social situation, we don't really get an accurate picture. So, and I think, because I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think neither one, the trait psychologists or the social cognitive, have it all right. I think it's a both and for both of them. And that's why I think it's really essential that, for instance, in an interviewing process, how to use assessments effectively. Well, I would at least do 3 interviews for a high-level position, and put them in entirely different contexts, social situations. I don't mean 3 interviews in the same weekend or same time. I mean, bring them back 3 times, because I find the more times you bring them back, in fact, the first time they're trying for the job, second time they know they're really good, and they're going to show you their true colors. And you'll be surprised what you'll see different on a 3rd interview than you will on a 2nd or even a 1st interview. But it's because of that social context situation I'm talking about. Another thing you need to understand about assessments is that every assessment has a margin of error. Even that math test you took in 8th grade, whatever, that had a margin of error. I mean, every test, every assessment has a margin of error, meaning that it's not quite accurate. No matter, and if someone says there's no margin of error in this test, they're either ignorant or they're lying, because every instrument has it has a margin of error. It has a percent of chance that test could be wrong. They're not foolproof. And so for major decisions, you do need to use the interviewing process. You need to use it in a confirmatory way. Confirm, is this what I'm seeing in these instruments? I think it's also very helpful and to be aware of that. Self-report instruments like DISC or Strengths Finders, or a lot of these instruments that are self-report, can be fake. I mean, if you want to be a D, you can be a D. You want to be an I, you can be an I. You want, Strengths Finders, you want to have these 5 strengths, you can have these 5 strengths. So I would at least include as part of that cadre of assessments that you have some with what we call fake scales, and I'll talk about those at the end here. But you need someone to have a scale that determines whether the person is socially biased in a positive way or in a negative way. So what are assessments are best for you to use? Well, of course, all the assessments I've worked on are the best ones. And I say that tongue in cheek, that's not necessarily true. You need to understand that all assessments are great for what they're intended to use. They were intended to be used for. But usually practitioners get in trouble when they try to use them for something that they were not specifically designed for. And therefore, I think you should always ask if someone brings an assessment to you as either a prospective employee or someone else, a teammate, they bring it, you always ask, there's two questions you should ask about every assessment. For what purpose was this assessment designed for? What was it created for? For instance, DISC was created by headhunters looking to put people on a team to get a job done. And that's what it's good for. How will people behave in the context of this team to get a job done? It's not good for much beyond that. It talks about behavior in the context of a team to get a job done. And then what's it intended to measure? That's the second question. So what was it designed for? And then what's it intended to measure? In other words, what are its scales, so to speak? And this may get some of you a little bit uptight. And if it does, you can talk to Paul about it. But I think the one instrument that I'll give an example that may not be valid, and there's two real things you should look at in every instrument: validity and reliability. And reliability is it repeatable? You take it today and take it next week and the week after, might get the same score. That's the first thing every instrument should be. Second, it's valid, and we assume everything's valid, but that's not necessarily true. And an example of that is like the Myers-Briggs. We all taken it, or we're aware of it. You're either an introvert or you're an extrovert. And in fact, you cannot be in the middle. It separates you into one of those two camps. It forces you. And so they call it a bimodal distribution. We have a lot of extroverts, and then you have no one in the middle, and a lot of introverts, and no one in the middle. Well, the reality is that's not a valid scale, because we happen to know from research, and every instrument ever created known to mankind that's ever measured introversion and extroversion, that's a normal curve. And there are more people in the middle than there are in either extreme. And yet, because of the way that Myers-Briggs scores it and forces you into one of those two quadrants and one of those two spheres. So that's a good example of where, instrument, it's helpful. I'm not saying you don't use Myers-Briggs, but it's helpful. It's a good, what we call heuristic development. It's a good thing for discussion purposes, but it's not necessarily valid, because more people are literally in the middle on that scale than are in either extreme. And yet that scale does not allow for anyone to be in the middle. So that's where you have to be careful with validity. Is it measuring what it really says it's measuring? I think there's two basic kinds of instruments you should be aware of. First of all, we call single domain instruments, like DISC, values, EQ, Thomas Kilmann conflict. I mean, they measure just one little band of a instrument of behavior or attitude or emotional construal. Then there are other instruments which are what we call multiple domains, and there's like the Berkman, the 16PF, Milan. I mean, and they measure multiple domains, and so there's a big difference between the two of those. And single domain instruments are great because they look just at that single domain. The strength is they look just at that single domain and do it very, very well. The weakness is that person is a lot more complex. The strength and the weakness. So if you're going to use a single domain instrument, you need to use more than one. Use multiple ones. The multiple domain instruments, those are great. Strength is they encompass multiple domains. The problem is they group them in categories that are not, you lose some of the descriptors that you would get if you did multiple single domain instruments. They're easier to understand because they combine them all into one, but you lose some of the descriptiveness you get from single domain instruments. So with that, apart from assessments, what are the best things that a lead pastor can do to do in hiring staff? The first thing I would recommend is don't hire without outside eyes. You may find it interesting. My life passion is assessment. I do not hire my own staff. I have proven I have made too many mistakes. I had 8 executive EAs, 8 executive administrators in 8 years. So I'm telling you, I cannot hire well. I mean, I'm really good at helping other people. So the first thing is, in a hiring process is always get some outside eyes, whatever that means for you in that context. Second thing is have clear competencies, have clear expectations. Competencies are what are the skill sets required. Expectations are things like, how many hours a week are we talking about? And that does that or does that not include worship time? Does it or does it not include leading a small group? Does it or does, you see, because competencies are skill sets. Expectations is really where the culture is defined. You remember earlier I talked about most people leave because of cultural issues. Culture is demonstrated in the details. So the culture of your staff and or the culture of your team is going to be influenced more by those details of expectations. And so I just say make sure you have clear expectations, clear competencies, and seek outside help. Now, last thing I want to talk about is, or last question I want to address is basically, how do you let your staff go with grace? I've been part of a whole lot of staff because every time we do a church consult, you know, Paul knows this, often there's a staff that has to leave as a result. And, I think that the big point I would say is, you always need to help them find a better fit. And I'll talk about that in a moment, but I think you need to, this was what I said earlier about promoting staff. I think you always need to promote staff. And assessments actually do that. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've been used to give assessments on staff to say, here's your A game. Your A game is not in the role you're in. And so let's get you, remember the left hand, right hand signing your name. Let's get you in a role, and it may not be on staff of this church. It may not be even part of this church, but let's get you in a role where you're able to do what you do naturally very, very well, rather than struggling over here trying to do something. And so often they'd rather continue to do work with their non-dominant hand and do it poorly. It's ugly and it takes a lot of effort rather than do something they're really, really good at. So it's often assessments can help them see their wiring and see how their wiring then informs their calling. Because I am convinced everybody has an A game. In fact, there's only one person. I've done thousands and thousands of assessments over the last couple of decades. And only one person I really believe was not called to be a bus driver, or was not called to be a pastor, but actually he was called to be a bus driver. And you know, when I got him out of ministry, he hated me, but he now thanks me because he literally had 15 years of great bus driving. I mean, he was a great bus driver, just as a lousy pastor. So everybody's got an A game, even Ron, who's a bus driver. And I think that, if they leave, I mean, if you're going to let them because of competency, you know, there's a reason of letting them go is that it's competency based. That's why you want to let them go. You need to determine outcomes that are needed. It takes a little more work if it's competency based, but you need to say, here's where the competencies are. Here's our outcomes. Here's what we needed. Here's what you did. And then help them find a position because you're not able to match, you're not able to meet these competencies. And help them find a position elsewhere often where they can do that, where they can make it fit. They're not bad people. That's the challenge, is help them see they're not bad people. It's just a bad fit. There's a totally different situation on that. And again, I find so often if you bring in outside help to help you in that process, whether it's a denominational or someone else, someone like us, if you bring someone from the outside in, they're able to deal with it a lot less emotionally attached than you, because the staff often feels you have a hidden motive or hidden agenda. If it's a cultural match, if it's the reason you let them go is because it's not an appropriate culture, I think you just need to acknowledge it and go sour very, very quickly. Identify where the misfit is happening. Where's the misfit in culture? It's not wrong, right? Culture is never wrong or right. It's just different. So again, they're not bad people. It's just a bad cultural fit. Like the others were a bad competency fit. These are a bad cultural fit. Again, sometimes it's helpful from someone outside of your culture to be able to point that out. And if it's a moral failure, and I mean, it can be sexual, but it can be financial, it can be relational, it can be a lot of different things. I would suggest you demonstrate grace also in letting them go, because so often I've seen churches react to moral situations in a not too graceful situation and do long-term damage to that person in ministry. I have some good friends who've been cut by elders and boards and who are lead pastors. It took years to get over some of the pain. So just, even if it's moral, I think you need to do it with grace. In other words, set your severance up to enable a path of restoration. Help them in some way, let them see that there is we do really hope, whether it's not restoration necessarily in this church or even in this town or wherever, but we do believe that God can restore, as he has demonstrated throughout the scriptures. And I think that, one of the keys to keep in mind is you let someone go. Well, first of all, you need a due process. Do not, the times I've been involved, it's too often I'm called too late in the process and there's not been a due process. And so you need the due process is basically what is the reason, and force yourself to identify what is the underlying cause. Is it a competency? Is it culture? Is it moral? What is it we've outgrown? What is, and be honest about that and follow a due process. And it's different for each of those situations. And then, acknowledge for your own self, not necessarily for them, but at least for your own staff development for the future. How did you not develop them if you outgrew them? Was there not a good fit from the start and you just missed it? If so, why? Did the role outgrow them? Okay, then just talk about that. How have they changed? How have you changed in that process? So those are my thoughts, Paul, Stan, and
all right. Greg, we're going to open up for questions. I want to ask the first one. You talked early on about leaders. None of us really know ourselves as well as we should. Apart from having someone come in and help assess us in terms of that, what can leaders do with some regularity to get the kind of feedback and information they need to help the leader see himself or herself as they need to be, assuming they have the ability of self-awareness? I mean, I look back at all the things I've done, and it was always about 4 or 5 years after I left that position, I thought, this is what I should have been, or this is how I should have acted. Is there anything you suggest to leaders to do on some kind of ongoing basis?
Great question. First of all, it's based on the big assumption you just shared, that some assumption of some self-awareness, because my take is and I'll put them in two camps. There's two camps of pastors, those who are what we call self-aware and those who aren't. And those who aren't self-aware, not much you can do. But those who are, I would suggest a couple things for me. One is reading books of leaders and ask yourself, as you read different kinds of leaders, is that my strength? Is that my strength? Another way, and I've done this a couple times in my life, is I've contacted several close friends and wrote 3 questions to them. What is it I do really, really well? What's my unfair advantage? Second, what don't I do well? And thirdly, what would you recommend I spend the rest of my life doing? And I would ask those 3 questions, and I've done that twice in my life, and it's amazing. And of people who would really be honest with me, and it's been amazing the insights that I've gained from that.
Okay.
Third thing for me is journaling. Journaling really helps me look at that. So.
Okay, good. All right, who else has some questions for Greg?
Hey, Greg, I've got a question. Richmond here, Wynn Langford. On the recruitment side, where do you recommend we go to get some pools of new talent?
Great question. And as you know, there's some great headhunters out there, and you can pay big bucks and all those other kind of things. We do know that this cultural fit is often neglected amongst most headhunters. And so, I think that most often, in fact, I saw the statistics the other day, that most often people who assume leadership positions in churches often come from an existing network rather than an outside network. I would first start with people in this group, people that you have friends with, people who you know that are that you have a social network, who know you and know the church. That's the best place to start. I mean, you can use headhunters, but again, the statistics aren't in a lot of favor of that.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you.
Okay. Who else?
I have a question, Greg. When you come to the place of recognizing that it's not going to work out with a staff member, is there value to using an objective measure to try to get that person on the same page? Because, a lot of times people aren't in agreement with your assessment that it's not working out, whether you have numbers or not. And especially in light of people often not leaving well Is there value to that, or do you just put the right process in place, lean into the process, and follow your due process?
No, I think I agree entirely with you. I think there is great value in trying to get them on the same page. And it's been amazing. Again, I can't tell you how many of these I've done. And I'm just in my head. I would say 85 to 90% of those have gone very, very well. But again, I'm an outside person. I bring assessments. I bring in kind of objective measures. That's not biased toward the lead pastor, the church, or the team, or whomever. And it really isn't rocket science. I went into a church of about 2,000 at the time. The executive pastor had applied for the lead pastor position. They had chosen somebody else. New lead pastor was in. He had me come in and do what we call a team assessment for their 22 staff, of which he was one. The executive pastor was one of them. And the executive pastor, I literally said, "It's time for you to leave." And here's the reason. I talked about his wiring, and I said, "You're wired to be a lead pastor." Now, you're angry because you didn't get the lead pastor here, but that has nothing to do with really ultimately what God's going for now, because the church made a different decision. So we helped him literally, and I have it on video. He shares later how that was the best, most honest conversation anyone's ever had with. But you have to be really honest with him about his wiring. Again, there's the more of an objective, concrete measure, and then say, how do we promote you? And he literally took a lead pastor someplace else and just loves it and is flourishing in that context. But in most cases, when that happens, it becomes an ugly exit, and that's how often church plants start and everything else. But
thank you.
Now, I'm not planning on having one, but when there is an ugly exit of a staff person, how do you help the church navigate those waters kind of post departure?
Well, I'll say, first of all, the first mistake churches make is they try to keep it quiet. And all that does is cause things to go underground and causes rumors and gossip to be even worse. And so the first thing I say is, let's not go underground about this. Let's figure out how do we take the high road, and we don't have to give all the details, but how do we express that this wasn't the best exit? And in social media today, if you don't do it well, you're going to get eaten up. So the key is to have someone, guide you through that process of scripting, both in social media and in public with the congregation. How do you announce that in a way that doesn't legally set you up for defamation of character and yada, yada, yada? You can say that, and you can say the person has left or the person chose to leave. You don't have to say that they were given an option of leaving or getting fired, but you can say those kinds of things. And you can say it was difficult for all of us. It was very difficult. You can say those kinds of things. You just can't say because they were incompetent or because they were, if you can't, you have to be very careful when you say those kinds of things.
Greg.
So I just want to be open on that. Yeah, go ahead.
Again, Wynn from Richmond. Do you offer any type of tools as far as separation agreements and things of that nature to help guide this idea of managing expectations on an exit?
Yeah, we do. Again, I try to stay away from boilerplates. Paul knows this, because given the church situation, given the staff situation, it can be really different for everything. But yeah, the key is for me the separation agreements need to come out of a process, and depending on what the process is, the separation agreement then reflects that process. For instance, so often there's a severance involved. Well, how is that severance paid? Is it paid in one lump sum, or is it paid on a biweekly basis as paychecks are going to be paid? And is it paid only if there's no negative communication coming from the exit? Well, we deal with that in some situations. We have to.
Yeah.
Gave the person a year severance at their current salary, but their lips were tight for that year, and it really saved the church a lot of good stuff. But again, they got the check every other week for a year.
Right.
But yeah, we do have separation agreements and so forth, but it comes out, what is the process that we've gone through to get to that due process I mentioned a moment ago? Because the document should reflect the process, it shouldn't be just here it is, I signed it. It should be, oh yeah, this makes sense. This is what we've gone through. This is where we are.
Yeah.
Greg, you had mentioned earlier about the difference between wiring and bandwidth. Would you talk about that for a moment? And include in that, what are the key elements that you see when you use the word wiring?
Okay. Let me first deal with the wiring issue, then I'll go back and deal with the competency versus bandwidth. When I talk about a person's wiring, I'm talking about the way they naturally do life. And as I said, there are like instruments like the Berkman and Stan use. That's a great instrument. It talks about, it's multiple domains. There are a lot of ways as a researcher that we can look at a subject, look at a person. And I think that's the key. Is wiring is mentioned for me. There are I have a 7-factor model that I use for how to understand a person, and it's much more in depth than you want to understand. But it involves emotions, it involves cognitive, it involves thinking, it involves social situation. The social situation, it involves what we call their construals, which is kind of like grit. It's kind of like their emotional, not their emotional, but they're basically how they approach a situation. Are they tough-minded or not? And it has these 7 factors. And so when I talk about a person's wiring, I'm talking about how do we assess how they act behaviorally? How do they behave? What kind of behavioral needs do they have? What kind of emotional needs do they have? What kind of, call it strengths finders or values? What kind of values do they possess? It's in some way, Paul, articulating all those in a quantitative way. Now, I use the 7-factor model, and 2 of them cannot be quantitatively assessed. One's the social situation. You can't assess that. That's why interviews are so very, very important. So that's wiring. Okay.
Okay.
The difference between and again, I can send you, if you want, that 7-factor model, and you can look at all the different instruments on each of the factors. But the difference between competencies and bandwidth. Jesus talks about a 1 talent leader, or one talent leader, and a 2 talent and a 5 talent. And I find it interesting that no one argues with Jesus that there are people who have different talents of gift, if you will, to invest. And I've seen that. I mean, there are 1 talent leaders, and there are 2 talent leaders, and there are 5 talent leaders. And for me, I initially thought I was a 5 talent leader when I was in my 20s. I now realize I'm a 2 talent leader. It's just got a lot of perseverance, and that's okay. But I mean, the interesting thing was, it is interesting for me as I look at leaders that we talk about bandwidth. In that sense, I am talking about, are they a 1 talent leader? Are they a 2 talent leader? Are they a 5 talent leader? Okay. So I'm talking about their capacity to lead large or lead not large. Some people are great at leading themselves. Some people are great at leading followers. Some people are great at leading leaders. And those are different skill sets. And actually, I think they're more hardwired than softwired. But again, leading yourself versus leading followers versus leading leaders. And there's 3 different kinds of leaders. And to me, it's a 1, 2, and a 5 talent leader. So that's bandwidth. Competencies are things you can teach people. So, I mean, you usually can teach people skills. And that's much of Gallup's research shows that you can teach them skills, but you're not going to change their bandwidth. So when we talk about outgrowing someone, it's usually because they're really good at leading themselves, or they may be really good at leading followers, but they're really not very good at leading leaders. So they're never going to be able to lead in a capacity that where the responsibilities, the roles now require you to lead leaders rather than leading followers.
Okay, thank you.
Greg, I didn't introduce myself last time. John from Redding, California. As you talk about culture and that cultural fit, what do you do when it's not the employee, but it's their spouse, and it's actually creating some issues among staffing? I'm sure you've never dealt with that before.
Yeah, I just dealt with it. That's why I'm laughing. There's one option, and that's for them to leave. Because if let's assume it's the wife. It can be a wife or husband, but if the wife's not happy, happy wife. Reality is, if there's a lack of cultural fit within the couple of one of the couple, that it just simply it's never going to be at peace at home, and so therefore they're never going to be at peace in the workplace, in the ministry. And I've tried, I have done, I'm sorry, John, I've tried about every option known to mankind as far as helping that spouse be more, but if they're not, and by the way, let me say this, some spouses may have some more cross-cultural gifting and they can adapt to a new culture. So I can say that some can act, but it's more of a cross-cultural ministry for them. But if they're expressing they have a problem, or if there's becoming a problem on a spouse, it usually means that they don't have any cross-cultural gifting or passion. And I've never been able, in that case, I have never been able to help that person other than leave.
How do you communicate that though in grace to the employee? Because you didn't hire the spouse,
right?
But then there's a separation that's coming because of that. I mean,
yeah.
The communication piece is something that escapes me.
It usually takes time. First of all, it's not something that's quickly done. And for me, it's been done when I've been brought in. I've been brought in because the team just doesn't feel like it's working. Something's wrong here, And so as I begin to get involved with the team, I begin to hear. I ask about spouse issues and I ask about, stuff like that. I begin to hear this. So as you begin to cull that out of the employee, as you begin to bring that out of them, and you have to bring them to the point of themselves seeing that and I'm just going to use, it's your wife. I'm going to use wife in this case, but it's your wife that's not happy. And if she's not happy, do you really, really want to minister in a culture where she doesn't fit? I personally think that's part of what Ephesians 5, where it talks about the husband dying for the wife. Few of us are going to be able to have the chance to throw our wife out of a speeding train and take a hit for her. But most of us will have a chance, like in this case, for you to die for your wife. What are you willing to give up? What are you willing to leave so she can to serve her? And so I approach it that way. And it's not a quick one conversation. It usually takes over a longer period of time for them to become aware of that. But
I actually love what you just said. That Ephesians 5 piece, I think is a great thing to hit.
Yeah, and I express it's your wife is not wrong. This is not bad. It's just simply a cultural fit. So it's not a bad thing. It's just it's more just difference. And so let's help. So because I don't want that, in this case, man. I don't want that man to feel like he's sacrificed for his wife and now he's going to hold it over the rest of her life. No, this is just simply a way of expressing his love in a Christian context.
In light of that idea, what we're talking about, do you offer any assessments that can aid ministers and their spouses to kind of understand the co-laboring aspect of the demands of a growing church and a challenging church?
Yeah, actually, there's one that how many of you are any of you using Rock RMS as a relational management system? Have you heard about it?
I looked at it, didn't go with it though.
How long ago? When did you look at it?
6 months, 8 months ago. Okay,
they're doing some radical changes. I mean, it was developed by CCV, Christ Church of the Valley, and now I know Willow's using it, and I mean a lot of North Point and Saddleback, a lot of the bigger churches are using it. And they've recruited me, and the reason I'm bringing this up, they've recruited me to write some assessments for them as part of their package now. So, and they want to have it done by the end of the year. So they want to have some of these assessments built into the package. And one of them is this instrument I'm working on that does actually look at that. It looks at how much does this person see their ministry as a team perspective or not. And again, it's not a right or wrong. It's just, it fleshes this out. So at least it gives you a quantitative way of discussing it.
Right.
Because again, it's not, as you know, some people work much better in team with a spouse or a family than others.
Right.
Some others, it's just a job and they go off and do it and they come back. But at least you need to identify that. And it's helpful to know. So that's what we've written this assessment for. And I just finished the items, and that will be out. And my deal with Rock is I'll let them use it, but I'm actually going to keep it myself and use it as well outside. Good. So it'll be an instrument that will come out before the end of the year.
Good.
Do you have any resources in relationship to the team fit, developing team fit? I know you have a process of helping churches work through that, but any resources a guy like me can access to help churches develop that?
Yeah, I think one of them is called the team fit exercise. And Stan, I'd be more than happy to. I mean, as I said, Paul gives stuff away. I'd be more than happy to share that with you. And it's a process where you actually give 6 assessments to the church, to the staff, in the moment. It's not like you give them in advance and they all bring them. You bring them into a meeting, and like I said, I've done it with as many as 27 staff in one meeting, and it was an 8-hour meeting, but. And you run them through. And what I find helpful, and I could write an instrument where everyone could just take it, we can put them on this wheel. But what I find really helpful, because this is a team fit exercise, is everybody, I assess them 6 ways, and we'll have everybody say, this is where I am on this assessment. And they're just saying it. I explain the assessment. Are you a concrete or abstract thinker? And I give a description, and then I let them pin themselves. And then everyone else in the room enters into that. Yeah, you are. Yeah, or no, you're not. And the reason it's a great exercise is because you get this kind of dialogue going across 6 different assessments. In the end, you end up with a wheel. You can see where everybody is in the wheel. And you'll find often that depending on the culture of the church, the wheel is lopsided, which is really interesting. So I've done this hundreds of times. And then it says, okay, so, can we live without this half wheel? Well, research says you can't. Somehow you have to figure that out. So anyways, we get into that later, but I'm more than happy to share that with you, and because there's nothing out there that I'm aware of it. And again, I could develop an instrument to do it, but it's much healthier to be done in the context of a team, having them speaking to each other, than it is, I think, just paper and pencil.
Okay. You'd mentioned it, but I use the Berkman profile, and find it very helpful in many ways. But getting churches to invest in it, and then set up a situation where we can dialogue much along that same line of, this is who I am. So, because oftentimes not only is an individual not self-aware, but other people aren't aware of what the needs are of that individual, which Berkman does a good job of projecting.
Yeah, as you said, most of us aren't aware of what we're not aware of. I mean, that's the problem.
And I'm assuming, Greg, I have no idea of how you teach self-awareness. Do you?
Well, actually, there's a great book. I don't know if you haven't read it. Carol Dweck wrote a book called Mindset, if you've not read that. She's an academician. She's now at Stanford. She was at Columbia. She's really, really well done. She basically breaks people down into 2 categories, what she calls fixed mindset and growth mindset. And self-awareness, Paul comes out of the growth mindset. She contends that from birth, at least we're conditioned, she won't say born this, but we're conditioned to think one way or the other, but you can change, but it's a difficult process. But it's a great book. It's not a Christian book. It's a great book called Mindset by Carol Dweck, D-W-I-C-K.
Okay, thank you. All right. Other questions for anybody?
Yeah, I got one more. Great. And this is Roy in Ogden, Utah. How differently would you approach an internal hire versus an external hire in terms of assessment? I think the assumption goes that culturally and socially, we kind of have a pretty good idea that they're a fit because they've been with us for a while. But would you approach the assessment of internal versus external differently?
Well, I do in this regard. I wouldn't do the 3 interviews, as I mentioned a moment ago, because it is, you do know, that's why internal hires tend to work better. It's because there's a cultural fit already. That's why we hire internally. But my observation is that internals don't work. It's usually because they circumvented the process. They liked the person. So they circumvented the competency issues. They circumvented the assessments that actually look at what's the wiring of the person. And simply because I've seen this happen over and over again where, well, we liked the person, so we didn't think we needed to do these 5 instruments or whatever it is. When in fact, those 5 instruments would have really shown that this person doesn't have the wiring to do the kind of roles and responsibilities. So my only word is I lean more on internal hires. I lean more on the instruments than I do on external hires.
Okay. Well, Greg, thanks for taking the time. I hope, gentlemen, you can see his background and experience. By the way, what's the name of your organization, Greg, or what?
It's Healthy Growing Leaders, and I started Healthy Growing Churches, and I copied off of Paul when I started that. Paul had Growing Healthy Churches, so I just called ours Healthy Growing Churches, and then I left a few years ago that and did Justice Assessments, which is Healthy Growing Leaders. I'll send you. Stan, I have your email, so I'll send them all the link to the notes today, and you can download the notes. And the notes are on a blog off our website, so you'll see it at that point.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Stan, I assume we'll do something, try to get something in the fall, September, October?
Yes. Yeah, we will.
Okay.
And what I would love to hear from anybody is, what are some of the pressing issues you'd like to see us try to address? That way we can hopefully find somebody that can speak to that. So if you have any ideas, love to hear them.
Okay.
I think a great topic would be the shift in giving patterns and donor development, and how that needs to become a part of our mindset in this emerging culture. People think less in terms of tithes and offerings, even though that's a biblical standard, and we need to keep teaching that. And you have to almost treat people like donors. So,
Okay. Thanks, Win. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Great. Anybody else? Well, Greg, thank you. And the rest of you, hope you have a great summer, and hope you get some time off and get regenerated for the next go round. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Stan.
All right. God bless. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.